Welcome back. Public discontent expressed through protests and riots in Africa has increased. Between 1990 and 2019, GDP and per capita income climbed steadily on the continent, and extreme poverty declined significantly in many African countries. The Institute for Security Studies says the rise in protests in Africa is more than just about macroeconomics. So to talk more about this, as researcher in African Futures and Innovation at the Institute, Stellah Kwasi. Stellah, thank you so much for your time this evening. So, discontent is more than just about macroeconomic issues. What is it about, have you found?
Thank you, Faith, for having me. So, discontent and frustration in general is more about the functioning of a society and the political system rather than the state of the economy of a particular government at any given time. So, as you've mentioned, wealth in general has increased over the years, at least since 1990, in many African countries, if not all. But this is a very narrow lens from which to view the wellness of people. So just because GDP has grown, for example, does not mean that its distribution is equal. Inequality has increased quite significantly. If you think about a country like South Africa and Southern Africa in general, it's one of the most unequal societies in the whole world, South Africa specifically. And so it has to do with human rights, social justice, and power. So in essence, economic freedom is meaningless without social and political freedoms. And just like everything, our needs change. So once you give people education, food, and all of that stuff, they then want to better themselves. And what does that mean? They want to express themselves. They want space for civic engagement. And in the absence of those things, you have friction. And that is why we have a lot of protests happening in Africa.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how the discontent actually manifests itself from what has been studied so far.
Right. So discontent, a lot of it has been through protests and riots. And we have seen a lot of people go onto the streets, especially in urban areas where people are more sensitized and people just have greater agency to get their voices heard. But before people get to protest, it's because they have most of the time tried other channels. And this then manifests in issues like low voter turnout. So when people have no faith that the systems in place, the systems put in place to bring change and not bring change, they then disengage from the civic process and thereafter turn to the streets when if violence is the only language that the governments of the day will understand, then people then eventually resort to that.
So then in looking at it from the South African context, I mean, we're speaking about protests. I mean, South Africa is known for the amount of protests that it actually has. We've got local government elections that are around the corner, and people are seemingly expressing a lot of discontent with the current status quo. Does that simply mean that we've got a lot of unhappy South Africans so far?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, people, and I think the other thing to clarify is that discontent is not just a political matter. It's a psychological and sociological thing as well. So over great periods of time, groups of people have felt a certain way. So there's something called the tunnel effect, where people you're like in a lane in traffic and you see another lane moving really quickly and you hope that your lane will also move. So for a while you tolerate it because you're like, eventually we will get moving, but it doesn't move. And so frustration boils over, and it's for a range of issues. So it's never just one specific thing. So in South Africa, apart from elections, you have issues like gender-based violence, usually disproportionately against women. And it's a complex issue. It's not just, macroeconomic. So I'm not a South African expert, so I wouldn't, delve too much into the South African issues. But broadly, it's complex. It's more than the economy.
So let's look at it from the African context then. So as we see that there are several protests, right, across the continent, experienced every single year because of one issue or another, do we find that by people protesting and as a result of their needs being met because of simply them going to the streets and protesting against a sudden or a reality, does it lessen now the discontentment? Does the protest, which leads to some kind of answer, lead to discontentment being lessened?
Right. So that's a really good question, but there is no. The answer is yes. Protests bring change. When people express their discontent, it brings some sort of change. So in Africa, for example, we have seen the democratization process sort of hasten when people get out to the street. Certain human rights issues are addressed. However, it does not always go the way people plan. I think people express discontent, but there is not always a plan for what is going to happen next. So there are very many countries in Africa that have not exactly transitioned the way people expected it to. So if you think of North Africa, Tunisia is the only country that sort of transitioned to a democracy. However, that democracy is being tested now. You have Algeria and Egypt, which have undergone some type of reforms, but that is not complete. And you have people in Algeria, the Iraq movement, when you think about it, people still protesting. And then you have places like Kenya where, a lot of changes have happened, but it's not a linear trajectory, and the result is not always expected. But protests, when people express their discontent, it alerts the political system, and in some shape or form, even if they don't always get to the destination in a straightforward manner, it moves the stake. Things move.
So when we're looking at just even when we look at North Africa and how we've seen, the status quo and the wealth, so for example, have increased progressively over time, but we're finding that a lot of the people are still discontent, so as it were. What will be the long-term sustainable solution for addressing the discontentment that we're experiencing then on the African continent? If protesting so far leads to lessened discontentment, can we actually sustain it?
Right. So, you can only protest for so long, and, protests are also only effective to a certain point. But I think the starting point is, really looking at our political systems and thinking about the systemic and structural issues that exist in our society. So if we at least have a genuine conversation and commit to distributing resources equally, I think that would be a good starting point, and that could change the design of political institutions. As well, recognizing that social and political freedoms, those are things that people need. So even if you educated me and, gave me all these good things, you supply water, you supply electricity, my needs are automatically, and they're bound to change. So at some point, I want greater freedoms. I want the freedom to express myself. I want the freedom to engage in other civic sort of things. And, these are also other issues around cultural identities, and it's a whole range of issues. So if we can have a situation where we build some type of social capital, where we have norms, and a collective goal for where we are going as a nation or as Africa, I think that's a good starting point. And then obviously the other obvious factors, such as eliminating corruption and building back better, making everyone included in the economy and moving away from models that just focus on individual economic actors. So if you think about Africa, most people operate in the informal economy. And how do we make sure that these people are, cushioned against the harsh economic effects, especially after COVID? We need to ensure that people have some type of social protection that then also enables them to participate in the economy. Because if you don't have the money to begin with, you say you don't even have an address, how do you even look for a job and sustain that job? So if there could be some sustained cushioning, then most people would then be able to participate in meaningful economic activity. But how do we do this in a context where governments are constrained of finances? And so that means that Africa needs to better think about how we are going to finance some of these things. So for one, decentralization, making local communities more empowered, participating or having more public-private partnerships, and thinking about areas that your country has strength in, comparative advantage. So what is your one strength, and how can you capitalize and harness in all those areas? And then
Stellah,
again,
then let's talk a little bit about the role that health plays in discontentment. Right now, the globe is facing a COVID-19 pandemic. And of course, the African continent has been severely hit by it as well. When we're looking at the trajectory of discontentment, do we know, or are there indicators of whether or not the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated discontentment on the continent? And how much of an impact it's made for those that are discontent, so as it were? Has it added fuel to the discontent fire, so to say?
Right. I would say it has, just given the impact, because it's not just a health impact. The measures that were put in place to ensure that everyone is safe. And it's such a delicate balance. But because of that, a lot of people have lost their jobs. And then beyond the economic effects, we have impacts such as studies in other areas like the US have already indicated that most places will a reduced life expectancy of about 2 years. And so Africa could see that as well, although the impact has not been as severe as other places in Africa. But yes, I would say that the measures put in place to prevent the spread of COVID have certainly exacerbated the impact of discontent. It has also highlighted the inequalities in our society, and they're undeniable now. So I think the simple answer is yes.
We'll leave it there. Stellah Kwasi from the Institute for Security Studies giving us the latest study now when it comes to discontentment in not only in South Africa, but really on the African continent.